Good morning, Renate Daniel. I'm very, very happy to have you here. Welcome to Breakfast at Kuznach. You are a psychiatrist, a Jungian psychoanalyst. You are the director of the program at the Carl Gustav Jung Institute, so a very, very important person there. And we've been waiting for this interview for a long time. Welcome. How are you?
Well, I'm fine this morning.
How is the post-coronavirus time for you?
Well, I had a lot of work, but I was happy to reschedule our program to a video conference program, and I'm happy that students like it. Also, we all are longing for the time when we can meet face to face.
So you just said that you moved the whole program of the institute in Zurich online.
Yeah, the summer semester program will take place online, and hopefully we can meet in fall face to face.
This must have been gigantic work for you.
Yes, it was a lot of work, but I'm happy that it works, or that it works. Yeah.
Okay. My first question, as usual, is who is Carl Gustav Jung, or who is your own Carl Gustav Jung?
Well, you know that he is the famous psychiatrist of Switzerland, and let's say my Carl Gustav Jung is the psychiatrist who described a concept of the psyche that helps me a lot to understand my clients, but my own person, my friends, my colleague. It helps me to understand the life of the psyche and the life as we live it. And so it's helpful for my work, but for my private life too. And for me, the concepts are really very helpful. I benefited a lot from his work.
And what is his relevance today in the 21st century?
Well, let's say it's a little bit tricky because in the world of science, even in psychology and psychoanalysis, he is not, how do you say, quoted. Yeah, when you read modern books or current books, you read a lot of famous analysts, but he is not mentioned very often. But there are other countries in the world, like South America or the United States or in Asia and in Russia, where they benefit a lot from his work and they read Jung. But perhaps in the center of Europe, he is not that actual anymore. You see it in the hospitals. Most physicians or psychotherapists are behavioral psychotherapists, but we, as I benefit a lot from his concepts, of course, I use it.
Why do you think is not, the word that is coming to me is used, but why do you think his work is not appreciated anymore? I mean, I was a student of literature and philosophy in my 20s, and of course we read Jung and Freud, but within a department of humanistic.
Yes, that's perhaps one important fact, because today in this scientific approach is you want to bring psychology closer to natural science. And he was interested in religion, in the question of meaning, in the mystery of life, in the mystery of the psyche. And there it's very difficult to give answers and to make research. Yeah. So it's, you are interested in the mystery of life. And this is not very close to natural science. And perhaps that's one aspect. And then, you know, that when when the Red Book was published, people asked themselves, did he suffer from a psychosis or something like that? And so perhaps there are many prejudices around his person.
Now that you mentioned the Red Book, what is your opinion about that? There are many that love it. Mm-hmm. Those are Son Shamdasani, for example. Yeah. And those that I wouldn't say hate it, but really dislike it, like Wolfgang Gigerich, who says shouldn't have been published. What is your opinion about it?
But that's a different question. Should it have been published? That was a decision of the family. And of course, it was his own process. It was his own process that he found something to work with his inner images, to work with his anxiety or all that came up to his conscious mind. And that's why it is so important, let's say for me, that he made the process himself. Yeah, he did not only ask others to develop, yeah, and to find answers to the psyche and to the psychological questions, but he did it on his own. And that's why we, when we are trained as Jungian psychologists, let's say we are obliged to do self-experience. So we get to know ourselves, and that's very important when we want to work with others. And so we see how his process worked, but we all have our unique own process.
You will publish soon a new book,
Yeah.
which I understand is about psychosomatic.
Yeah, Psyche and Soma, yeah.
But your previous book, titled in English, Taking the Fear Out of the Night, you underline that, and I quote, some neurobiologists come to the conclusion that we dream primarily in order to solve the problems or develop new ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond the neuroscientific findings, you underline that strategic learning can happen through dreams and that dreams contribute to health. What are dreams? Can you say more about these two quotes?
Mm-hmm. What are dreams? Well, perhaps to summarize it, we have experience when we are awake. We now have an experience, yeah, and there are experiences at night. We are sleeping, we lost our control, and in the morning when we wake up, we remember, there was a kind of story. While we were sleeping, there was a story, there was a kind of experience, and that's what we call dream. Yeah? So there is a life when we are awake, and there is a life at nighttime. And the modern research, as we have the devices to make research on sleep, today we know, because you can sleep in a laboratory and then the researchers wake you up, let's say every 90 minutes or every 30 minutes. We know that everybody is a dreamer. The problem is that it's difficult to remember the dreams. Yeah, sometimes it's easier and sometimes it's not so easy, but we are dreaming, and it seems that all mammals are dreaming. So usually there must be a benefit, or it must have a meaning. Yeah, and that's what that in antiquity, even in the Bible, there are descriptions, or dreams are described, and so you see that first of all it's a very old. How can I say? It's a very old thing, or the dream is very old, and people were interested in dreams, and they were convinced that dreams are important or can be important.
You underline that according to the Talmud, a dream which is not interpreted is in a read letter. Yes. Or you say that dream interpretation then means attempting to find an answer for our unconscious images and cultivating a dialogue between the unconscious and the conscious. Yeah. You also say dream interpretation then is a dialogue with one's soul. Why often people don't look at dreams seriously? Why are we afraid to look at the content of the dreams? Why do we forget dreams so easily?
Let's say I don't can give you an answer why we forget the dreams. Yeah. But what we can see, if there are many emotions in a dream, let's say negative emotions like anxiety, then we call it very often a nightmare, then you can't forget it. Yeah. But perhaps when there are not that many emotions in a dream, in the story, then perhaps it's easier to forget them. And this reminds us, or it's similar to the situation when we are awake, because the more intense your emotions are, the less you will forget your experience, an encounter or whatever. And when it's not very important, and important means there are emotions, then you will forget many experiences. It's not that important for you. But when there are many emotions, you will not forget it. And so if there is a very positive emotion, or if there are negative emotions, then it's easier to remember that the dreams. And usually it's easier to remember them when you are in a crisis, because then there is a lot of, there are many emotions.
You made a difference between what I call big dreams and, let's say, daily dreams. What is the difference?
Well, be aware that all your questions, the answer cannot be that precise. Yeah, it's not possible. Even the answers I gave you before, it cannot be that precise. But for him, let's say, there can be dreams that are important for mankind. Yeah. So when the Pharaoh in the Bible had a dream, as he was the leader of his people, then it can be a very important dream, because he is responsible for his people. And then very often in the beginning of a therapy, one's own dreams, they are talking about father and mother and perhaps the external world. And later, not always, but sometimes, there are dreams, they are no longer interested in your, let's say, personal environment. They are no longer interested in your partners, but there are symbols, let's say a church or a stone or a large tree, whatever. So it's something that refers to life itself, let's say it that way. It's not only your individual problems, but it's the question of life, perhaps of meaning, or the mystery of life. And then that's what he called the archetypal dreams, because the questions, they belong to all of us. That's the question: why do we live? What is the meaning of life? And so on. What is it for?
In your book, you also underline that the moment from awake to sleep state is very important. You write, and I quote, "We can only go to sleep when we let go, when we allow our ego to plunge into the unknown." And you add, "These require the ego to relinquish control." Using control or too much control, is it a problem for our society?
Well, let's say the history of mankind is, we want to overcome nature in a way, because we would not have a flat, we wouldn't have medicine, we wouldn't have all the technical devices if we allow the nature to do its job, let's say it that way, because we want to protect ourselves, we want to live longer, we want to be secure. And so this is something that belongs to mankind. We cannot avoid it to overcome nature, but we are a part of nature. And our instinct, or our instinctual life, is one aspect of nature. And for example, we need to sleep, because otherwise we cannot stay in a healthy state. And so the ego has to let go when you are in distress, and when you have many problems, and when you are thinking about your problems. Then the ego is so awake that it's difficult to sleep, but we need to sleep. And so of course it's a question of control. And on one hand, we need to control. This means we are disciplined beings. We can focus on something that's helpful. But for me, it's, let's say, a healthy state is that we are able to control, and things we can't control or we shouldn't control, to let that go. So to find a balance between control and no control.
A very random question that just came to my mind. Is the whole coronavirus story about this? Rebalancing control and what we cannot control, wake and sleep?
At least, let's say, coronavirus faced us with death. we are threatened by death. We don't want to die, and death is an aspect of nature. Let's say when you talk about the whole nature, which is Mother Earth, let's use that word. Nature tries to be in balance, and balance means animals, plants, and human beings are born, but they have to die, so that there is a balance for the health of the whole nature. Need birth and death. And of course, now we are facing death and we are threatened by death. And then, of course, this causes panic, yeah, because Mother Nature threatens us. And it's, how can I say, I don't find the English word. It's while we were threatened and we stopped our cultural life and our technical life, and we stayed at home, Mother Nature got healthier. So for Mother Nature, it was positive that we stayed at home. Yeah. Of course, it was positive for our individual life too, because this was one, how can I say, something to do so that not that many people will die. Yeah. But
You mentioned death. Jung actually made it a pillar of his theory that our life could be divided in stages, and actually two major stages. The first one and the second one, the natural aim, which goes up until to 35, 40 years of life, and then the second one, which is the cultural aim. That is when we become aware that we are mortal.
Yeah.
Why are we so afraid of death? And why the coronavirus really, as you underlined, brought up this panic of death? What is your idea? Not looking at Jung, but what is it? Because I know you have many ideas.
The question is too big, let's say it that way. There are too many aspects, and why we are afraid of death. This would need hours, and I need to think about it, but it must be something innate. We don't want to die, of course. We don't want to die. And that's, as you mentioned, it was Jung's idea that we have to find our answer concerning death. And how can I say, we leave now the field of dreams, but perhaps for several minutes, let's say it that way. Coronavirus showed us that the more we focus on the physical death and isolate ourselves and protect ourselves, on one hand, it's positive, but from a Jungian perspective, the question is the shadow. What are the negative aspects? And that's what Jungian psychology is for. On one hand, when you stay at home, you isolate yourself, you can avoid the physical death, but you are dying perhaps inside. This is the kind of side effect. You cannot hug persons. You don't meet persons. You cannot engage in life. Yeah, you have to stay at home. So perhaps you are waiting for the physical death, and you are sacrificing something. Not everybody, but some people, they understand that they sacrifice their life when they are no longer able to be active in the way they need to be active. And this can mean that you want to work, or that you want to go out in nature, or that you want to be active in a way you are no longer allowed to do. And so perhaps some have had the feeling that they are waiting for death because they cannot see their grandparents or see their beloved ones, or do the work they want to do. So this is for me very important, and perhaps the dreams can help you, or something else. You have to find out what is your personality, and how is your lifestyle that you are healthy, and not only in a physical way, but in a psychological way, because there is, of course, a physical health, but the health of your soul, or your psyche.
Before to go back to dreams, actually, to nightmare, I would like to ask you to share what you told me the other day in supervision about death.
Yeah.
And actually the question, how do you want to die? Because what you underline, I think, is very, very important and should be shared. What do you think?
To be honest, I want to be awake when I die, because this will be the only, this experience will be a single experience. Yeah, the physical death, it's only once that you experience that. And I prefer to be awake. I don't want to sleep. I want to have this experience. Yeah, and to be awake. That's my
When we had that discussion was really important, you know, to reflect. Can you imagine you dying? Can you imagine your death? And even, are you ready to go? That is something very important. If you think of a lifespan, for me at least.
to be honest, there is, I want to live. I want, perhaps, as my the sisters of my grandfather, they were in their 90s when they died. So when I was a child, I was convinced everybody dies, especially women in my family, when they are in their 90s. So as a child, I thought, yes, I will be in my 90s when I will leave Earth and when I will die. So this is one aspect in me. I hope that I can die in my 90s. But during the Corona crisis, when I saw all that, I thought, well, when I have to die tomorrow, it's okay too. Yeah. So there are many aspects, but this aspect that I accept to die helped me to be free and to live how I want to live. Yeah. And of course, this is something individuals, something individual. Yeah. But I want to live and not to sacrifice too much of my lifestyle, let's say it that way.
The very last question about coronavirus, although it's linked to your thought, you have a special view on technology. For me, coronavirus, apart from that, is also about technology. How a nation, how a public health system can cope with such an emergency through technology. Technology in the past decades helped to generate life, to extend life, to avoid death. If I compare the pandemic of the coronavirus, and if we look at the Spanish flu, well, with the Spanish flu, there was little technology. But now the panic was, if I get sick, will I get a ventilator? Will I get into the hospital? So also the issue about technology is very important. The rush for technology to extend life or create life.
Yeah. Yes, of course. We don't know, or let's say it that way. Coronavirus confronted us with limitations. And one limitation is the physical death, but it showed that we are limited in our devices. Let's say it that way. The question you mentioned, will there be a place in the emergency department of the hospital? Yeah. Will there be enough nurses and physicians to help me, and so on? So the question is, it's a lot about limitations. Are we limited? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what we have to face. And this is a difficult question in a time when there is an advertising, accept no limits. There was, I forgot the brand, sorry. There was an advertising, accept no limits. And this seems to be a wish, or, yeah, but this is not the case. There are limits. And these limits, some feel sad, others feel angry that we have to accept limits. Yeah? And this is something that is very emotional. Limits, borders are something that raise emotions, strong,
And
intense.
even doubt, I would say. After this, the tour,
We
I
have,
want to come back to
yes,
your
we come.
but it was important for me to ask you those questions. Nightmares. What are nightmares? What makes a dream a nightmare? You write it down beautifully in the book.
Yeah.
But I would like to ask you.
Okay. When you wake up in the morning or during night, usually a nightmare is a psychosomatic experience, because on one hand there are these images of the dream, and on the other hand you have a physical reaction. You are sweating, perhaps your heart is racing. There are so intense emotions, anxiety and fear, so your whole personality is involved. Yeah? You have images, thoughts, emotions, and physical reaction. That's a nightmare. To summarize it, yeah.
Can nightmares be transgenerational or transpersonal?
Yes, I have examples for both of the things you mentioned. There are, for example, I wrote of, let's say, I guess she was 14 or 15-year-old girl in the United States, and she had a lot of anxiety symptoms and panic attacks, and especially a nightmare that came very often. And she dreamt that she was imprisoned in a concentration camp. And she met a psychiatrist, and they found out that also the family, they were Protestants, that the generations before, there was one part of the family, they were Jewish people, and she had an uncle who was a Nazi. And as soon as these circumstances were disclosed to her, the nightmares stopped and she had no longer panic attacks. So she dreamt something, let's say, that was connected to her ancestors. Yeah. And I have several examples that are close to this example. And to come to an end, this, let's say, the result of such an example is that there seems a necessity of the soul, or the soul is longing for the truth or longing for the reality from the past. Because very often, as soon as you know the secrets of the family, then the nightmares stop.
This is an amazing example. You mentioned a couple of times the mystery of life. Why these kind of nightmares? Why this young woman or this girl dreamt this? Is it a kind of family repairment? Is it a kind of sensibility towards the family? How do you explain that?
I don't know if it's only individual. Perhaps this is one aspect. As I mentioned before, when I give you an answer, this is only one aspect or two. There are always many aspects to see it more. Yeah, there are many aspects. One aspect is I have, or let's say I believe, or it seems, let's say it that way, that the dark aspects in the family or even in the collective, or let's say from a nation like the Nazi situation, that this has to be seen and to be witnessed, and that we have to know that dark aspects belong to life. And it seems that the soul, yeah, is not only interested in joy and fun, but wants to see the very dark aspects or shadow aspects and something that happened in reality. Yeah. And you need to know. And I don't know if this girl I mentioned had siblings, and if they dreamt it. That would be interesting to see. Are you chosen? Is it important for you and for your life? So we would need more research on that. So we have these single cases where we can see that it's important to know. Yeah.
In the introduction of your book, you give 3 examples and underline that people found individual responses to their nightmares which work for each of them personally. And you add that they, nightmare, disappear as soon as their message has been depicted, has been understood. Can you say more? Of course, you said something already, but can you give other examples?
Yeah, this seems to be a rule that understanding the message calms you down. This is what I can see. And so it's something of my experience. How perhaps do you want to have another example?
Yes, would be great.
What example comes to my mind? As I mentioned, this Hungarian director, Benz Fliekauf, he mentioned when he has a nightmare, he knows that he has to do a new film, a new movie. Yeah. So his soul calmed down. It was like, aha, the nightmare, and he found it out spontaneously, is a kind of task. I have to do something. Yeah. Or I give you another example of a woman who was in a concentration camp in reality. And during the concentration camp, she was imprisoned in Ravensbrück. And perhaps you know, many prisoners there, there were, how is it called, medical experiments. They were done by the physicians. And during her time in the concentration camp, she had not any single nightmare. But from the first night on in freedom, she suffered from nightmares. And she didn't dare to talk to somebody, but she wrote a diary. And as soon as she had written everything, all nightmares and all the experience, all the cruel experiences she made in the concentration camp, she had no more nightmares. So she found an answer. She didn't dare to disclose the nightmares, but she wrote a diary. Yeah. And then she calmed down, and later she wrote that there were only perhaps few circumstances in her later life when the nightmares came back, and she understood that she had to reduce her workload. And then she calmed down. So even without psychotherapy, if you watch yourself, if you are really in connection, you are connected with the nightmares and the soul, you will find an answer, your individual answer. What do I have to do to calm down? Because you can say the soul is in kind of distress. Yeah, you are facing something terrible, but you can cope with it, or you can find an answer.
You write, writing or drawing objectifies the nightmare experience and make it visible to the outside world. Mm-hmm. Then you also say the act of illustrating our dream images frequently has a calming effect on our emotion. Mm-hmm. What would you suggest to those that actually cannot find this calming effect, those that keep having the same nightmares night after night, and maybe they are in psychotherapy, maybe they are trying to objectify the dream?
Of course, when I describe the process that usually is helpful, this is something that works very often, but sometimes it doesn't work all time, or it doesn't work in every single case. To say it in general, I would try to find out what is the situation in the dream and what about the ego, which means what happens in the dream, and are there any resources, are there any helpers, or what would be a helpful attitude, what would be a helpful strategy, what about the situation, is there anything in the situation in the dream that is connected with our life when we are awake. So I will try, of course, I try to find a bridge. I try to find out, is there a message that I can understand? But of course, it's like, how can I say? It's it's an experiment. I don't know. I cannot 100% say, or I cannot say that it works 100%. I can try to, let's say, to play with these images, yeah? And as far as I see, very often it works, let's say it that way.
I remember you described the example of a girl who's having nightmares, and I think she is dreaming of monsters.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And would you describe that example?
Yes, it was a boy, let's say 5 or 6 years old, and he dreamt of monsters. Yeah, and he went to therapy because he woke up at night and went to his mother, and that's why she couldn't sleep too. And he painted the monsters, and spontaneously he had the idea or the fantasy to put a spider in front of the monsters. Yeah, and so he painted himself, and then between him and the monsters there was a spider. And isn't it interesting that out of his soul he let's sorry, I have to come back. Once, or I mentioned that we try to understand our dreams, but the dreams is not a fixed result or something that is fixed or petrified. You can play with it or you can work with it. So you can continue the process, let's say, in the unconscious or from the unconscious. Because what did the boy do? He didn't say, well, not consciously, of course, he didn't accept the image as a kind of stone or petrified, but he worked with it and he added the spider. And so his soul calmed down because the spider protected him and the monsters had to face the spider. So he worked with it and he continued the process. And he had less nightmares, but he, let's say, he forced his mother to write them down. So he was interested in having a diary, yeah, and to witness it. And so he found his own way to calm himself down. And that was a 5-year-old boy. Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Before we conclude, I would like to ask you, can you share something about your new book, Psyche and Soma? Why your interest in Psyche and Soma?
Well, you see, already the topic of nightmare, as it is, as I mentioned, a psychosomatic experience. Let's say, since I'm studied medicine, I was interested in psyche and soma, but it's a very difficult question, let's say, that where it's a kind of mystery. And for me, let's say, if I make a psychological process or if I develop my psyche and my personality, it has always an impact on the body because we are physical beings. And that's perhaps why I was so shocked at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. I read a lot for this book and I shared my own experience with my clients, because today we know that psyche and soma are very deeply connected. For example, when you are in panic, yeah, and when you are full of anxiety, then your immune system will not work that good. That's what we know today. Yeah. So the question, the psyche has a big impact on our physical health. Yeah. And as psychotherapists or analysts, we are working, let's say, on the psychological aspect. And so I want us to be more aware of the impact of the body. And this is really amazing and astonishing. And it seems that not that many scientists, even not the virologists, where perhaps they don't know this research or they are not interested in that. I don't know. Yeah. Perhaps it's not that common. But for me, it's important for us as psychotherapists to know that there is an impact on the body. Yeah? And when you are working as a physician, of course, it has an impact on the psyche. And that's what they have to know too. For example, during a cancer treatment, the medication and everything you do has an impact on the body, yeah, and on the psyche too. So we should know more about, let's say, the connection between psyche and soma. And you will find out that we usually we have a worldview concerning the question psyche and soma, and that's what I discussed too, that we are more aware of our worldview concerning this topic.
Renate, thank you very much for your time.
Welcome.
I'm so happy we had the chance to talk. I wish you good luck with the online semester this summer, and I hope to see you very soon again in Zurich.
Thank you too.